Hello, and welcome to Investment Insight, your clear take on the markets. Let's get started.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It is definitely a wild day to be looking at the numbers.
I mean, wild is an understatement. I was looking at the terminal this morning, and just for context for you listening, today is Monday, February 23, 2026, and the only word that came to mind was whiplash.
Yeah, whiplash is about right. If you are managing a global supply chain right now, you probably aren't sleeping much.
No kidding. We have President Trump in the White House, and for the last few months, I think the market really thought it had his strategy figured out, right?
Right, everyone had priced in those specific reciprocal tariffs.
Exactly. The idea was simple. If another country taxes U.S. goods at, say, 20%, the U.S. taxes their goods at 20%. An eye for an eye.
In theory, yes, it was a very targeted approach. But then the Supreme Court stepped in this week and basically dropped a hammer on the whole thing.
They didn't just hit pause either.
Now, they completely dismantled the legal mechanism the administration was using.
Right? Because the administration was using IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And the court essentially said, you can't use emergency powers to rewrite the tax code for specific countries without getting Congress involved.
Exactly. It was deemed an overreach. And usually, when the Supreme Court says stop, the government stops. You get a cooling off period.
Everyone takes a breath.
Right. Everyone regroups. But that is definitely not what happened here.
Not even close. Within hours, the administration pivoted. They dusted off this really old, completely different law.
Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974.
Yes, Section 122. And I want to pause on that because this is where we really need to dig in for you listening. Most people know what a tariff is, but this legal alphabet soup actually really matters to your investments.
It absolutely does.
So IEPA is about national emergencies. What exactly is Section 122?
So Section 122 is fascinating because it's rarely used.
No.
It is designed specifically for a balance of payments crisis. It allows the president to impose a temporary surcharge, up to 15%, on literally everything entering the country.
Everything.
Everything. But only if the U.S. is hemorrhaging too much capital or the trade deficit gets dangerously high.
So they basically went from a sniper rifle approach, targeting specific countries for specific things, to just pulling out a shotgun.
A shotgun with a timer attached to it. That's the crucial nuance here.
Right, because Section 122 has a hard expiration date, doesn't it?
It does. It only lasts for 150 days unless Congress steps in to extend it.
Okay, let's try to unpack this for someone who might not look at trade law every day. I was trying to think of an analogy for this whole situation.
I'll have a good analogy. Let's hear it.
All right, imagine you have a landlord that represents the U.S. government. And this landlord has a few very specific tenants in his building that he really doesn't like. He thinks they're causing trouble, underpaying, whatever.
Okay, tracking so far.
So he tries to use this specific rule in the lease, let's call it the bad tenant rule, to raise the rent massively just on those specific guys.
Which is the IEPA reciprocal tariffs.
Exactly. But then a judge comes in and says, hey, you can't use that rule. It is illegal to discriminate like that without a better reason.
So the bad tenants think they are safe.
Right. They start celebrating, but the landlord turns around 5 minutes later and says, fine, I am declaring a building-wide maintenance emergency. Everyone's rent goes up a flat 15% to cover costs.
While I figure out a totally new legal way to evict the bad guys.
Yes, exactly. So everyone, friends, enemies, the quiet guy in apartment 4B, they all pay higher rent for 5 months.
That is a remarkably accurate way to look at it.
Yeah.
The 15% is the emergency rent hike. But the targeted eviction is what the landlord is planning for after the 150 days are up.
Which completely changes the math for basically every country on Earth.
It really does. And, we aren't looking at the politics of this today. We are just looking at the arithmetic. And according to recent data, this sudden legal shift has created some very accidental winners and some very, very surprised losers.
And this is where it gets so interesting to me. Looking at the data, especially recent analysis from the Financial Times and Global Trade Alert, there is one massive country that popped up as a relative winner here.
It's the last country anyone would expect.
China.
China.
How is that even possible? The entire point of these trade wars is usually to pressure China.
I know, it's completely counterintuitive. But you have to look at the delta. You have to look at the change from where we were literally just last week.
Right, because under the old plan, the reciprocal plan...
Under that old plan, the tariffs, specifically targeting China, were going to be massive. If China had a 25 or 40% tariff on a U.S. good, The U.S. was going to match it exactly.
So Chinese exporters were staring down a barrel of maybe 30 or 40% taxes.
Correct. But now that reciprocal system is gone. It's illegal, and it has been replaced by a flat 15% global rate.
Which means for China.
For a country like China facing those massive barriers, a flat 15% is actually a huge discount.
A discount? That is just wild to think about.
The data from Global Trade Alert actually puts a number on it. They suggest China's average weighted tariff burden could drop by about 7.1 percentage points under this new temporary system.
So by trying to tax the whole world because the court blocked the specific tax, the U.S. accidentally gave its biggest rival a tax break.
In the short term, yes. And Beijing is very aware of this. According to Reuters, they are playing it very cool.
I bet they are.
They aren't celebrating in the streets. They are taking this sort of moral high ground, promising to conduct a full assessment. But they're using the moment to argue that the U.S. should just withdraw all unilateral tariffs entirely.
Wow. Taking the moral high ground while saving on taxes? Not a bad week for them.
It isn't, but, and there's always a big but here, it is a track.
A trap. Okay, explain that.
The U.S. Trade Representative is not blind to this math. They know Section 122 is just a placeholder. It's just a bridge to buy them time.
To do what?
To prepare massive targeted investigations under Section 301.
Section 301. For you listening, let's refresh what that covers.
Section 301 is the Unfair Trade Practices Law. Unlike the broad, flat tariff we have today, 301 requires a very specific investigation. The U.S. has to prove harm.
Harm like what? Overcapacity?
Overcapacity, forced labor, digital discrimination, those kinds of things.
So they are basically spending these 150 days building an ironclad legal case to hammer China specifically, since the Supreme Court won't let them do it automatically.
Exactly. China wins the sprint right now, but they are walking straight into a buzzsaw for the marathon.
Okay, so if China is this accidental winner, let's look at the other side of the coin. Who are the losers? Because looking at our traditional allies like Europe and Japan, they do not seem happy at all.
They are absolutely in the relative damage category here. The European Union is furious.
Why so angry, though? I mean, 15% isn't zero, but surely it's better than a full-blown trade war.
Well, their whole argument is that a deal is a deal. They thought they had agreements in place.
Sure.
Right. They thought there was a ceiling on tariffs, around 15% or maybe lower, that was negotiated. But this sudden legal chaos has just thrown all that certainty out the window.
And I imagine for a huge German car manufacturer or a French luxury brand, that uncertainty is actually worse than the tax itself.
It really is. The biggest problem for the EU isn't the 15% rate. It is that 150-day limit.
Because how do you plan?
You can't. If you are a business owner, how do you price your goods? How do you sign a supply contract for next year when you know the rules completely dissolve in 5 months?
You freeze. You just don't do anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Policy risk is becoming institutionalized in the EU right now. We're even seeing talk of them delaying the ratification of other trade agreements because they just do not trust the stability of the U.S. as a partner.
That is a serious ripple effect. And it's not just Europe. Japan is arguably an even closer ally in the Pacific. You'd think they would get a pass.
You would think so. But in a flat tax scenario like Section 122, there are no favorites. The landlord raised the rent on everybody. Japan is getting hit hard. In fact, Onodera Itsunori, who is a senior member of the ruling LDP in Japan, actually came out and called these new tariffs outrageous.
Outrageous. That is incredibly strong language for a Japanese diplomat.
It is. He even warned that it could push allies away from the U.S. And the reason Japan is hurting so much is very similar to Europe. Their economy relies heavily on sensitive exports.
Let me guess. Automobiles and steel.
Automobiles and steel.
And those are the exact things the U.S. usually wants to protect.
Precisely. Because once those 150 days of Section 122 are up, the expectation is that the U.S. will pivot to Section 232 tariffs.
And Section 232, that's the national security one, right?
Yes, it's based on national security. And historically, those tariffs almost always target steel and autos.
Wow. So Japan is paying 15% right now with the very real threat of even harsher, laser-focused tariffs coming in just 5 months.
Exactly. It shows how that ticking clock is causing more stress than the number itself. Uncertainty is always the market's worst enemy.
It really freezes capital. Nobody is going to build a new factory when the foundational law expires in July.
Nobody.
I want to pivot a bit and spend some time on a region that I think is critical. For you listening, especially if you have ties to the Korean market or are investing heavily in Asia, South Korea gets lumped in with Japan a lot.
They do, usually just branded together as Asian allies.
Right. But based on the data, does that label hold up right now? Is Korea in the same boat as Japan?
It is a lot more complicated for Korea. Looking at the analysis, we actually categorize Korea as mixed.
Mixed. Okay, not a clear win like China, but not a disaster like Europe.
Right. Let's start with the good news for them.
Please do.
The IEPA tariffs, the reciprocal ones that the Supreme Court struck down, those were going to be devastatingly high for certain Korean sectors.
Really? Because the U.S. felt Korea was subsidizing them?
Yes. The U.S. often argues that Korean industries like shipbuilding and steel benefit from heavy government support. If the U.S. had matched those perceived barriers, Korean heavy industry would have taken a massive direct hit.
So the Supreme Court essentially helped them dodge a huge bullet.
They did. The immediate threat of a massive tariff shock just vanished. And that buys the Korean government leverage. But mostly, it buys them time.
I'm sure privately there is a lot of relief and soul about that.
Undoubtedly. They've stated they are monitoring the situation, but dodging that reciprocal hammer was a win.
But
There is always a but.
well, tell us the bad news.
The bad news is deeply tied to the structure of the Korean economy. Korea is what economists call an intermediate goods powerhouse.
They make the stuff that goes inside the stuff.
Exactly. Semiconductors, EV batteries, advanced materials, things that brands like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG produce that are integral to the U.S. supply chain.
Right. Highly integrated.
And a flat 15% tariff hits those high-volume, lower-margin intermediate businesses very hard.
Right.
But the real danger for Korea is something unique to their position. It's what I call the sandwich effect.
The sandwich effect. Break that down for us.
Think about Korea's geographic and economic position. They are squeezed right between China and the U.S. On one side, this new 15% U.S. tariff makes Korean goods more expensive for American buyers.
Right. The rent went up.
But on the other side, remember what we said about China?
China got a discount. Their rate dropped.
Exactly. So suddenly, Chinese goods just became much more price competitive against Korean goods inside the U.S. market.
Oh, wow. I hadn't even thought of that dynamic. So Korea is losing its price advantage to China while also paying more to the U.S.
You've got it. If you sell a generic industrial component and your Chinese competitor is suddenly paying less tax than they did last week and you are paying 15% more, your margins get squeezed from both sides. You are the meat in the sandwich.
That is brutal.
Yeah.
So going back to that landlord analogy, it's like Korea was about to get evicted under the old rules.
Right.
The judge stopped the eviction, which is great. But now they have to pay higher rent, and D, their biggest competitor in the building just got a rent cut.
That is a perfect way to put it. It makes competing incredibly difficult. And there is one more layer of risk for Korea and for Taiwan as well, honestly. The tail risk.
Tail risk. For you listening who might not be deep into statistics, what does tail risk mean in plain English?
It basically means an event that has a low probability of happening, but if it does happen, the damage is absolutely catastrophic.
Okay, so what is the catastrophic event here?
It goes back to the 150-day clock. When Section 122 expires, the U.S. will likely switch to Section 301 or Section 232 investigations.
The targeted ones.
Yes. And what are Korea and Taiwan's biggest exports?
Cars and semiconductors.
Right. If the U.S. decides that national security requires strict tariffs on foreign chips or foreign autos to protect domestic manufacturing, Korea and Taiwan are right in the crosshairs.
Taiwan has been pretty quiet, haven't they?
They've said the impact is limited for now, which is technically true under the 15% flat rate. But if the U.S. targets digital and industrial policy later, Taiwan's semiconductor industry becomes a massive target.
So they are paying the 15% rent now, knowing full well that in 5 months, the landlord is coming to thoroughly inspect the garage and the electronics room.
Exactly. It's like dodging a speeding ticket today, only to realize your car registration is completely expired and the police are coming to your house in 5 months. The shock is gone, but the future is very, very cloudy.
That is such a precarious position to be in. Just briefly, before we move to the investor takeaways, what about India? Because I saw a headline that they actually paused their trade negotiations.
They did. AP News reported that India essentially delayed sending a delegation to the U.S. And this tells us something really important about how India operates.
Which is what?
They care far more about the legality and stability of a deal than the specific numbers.
They don't want to sign a contract with a partner who changes the underlying laws every week.
Correct. Whether a tariff is 15% or 18% matters a lot less to them than knowing the deal will actually stick for 5 years. So they're just stepping back to wait and see how the dust settles.
Okay, so let's zoom out. We have this crazy map of the world right now. China is secretly smiling, at least for a minute. Europe and Japan are just fuming. Korea is squeezed in the sandwich. India is waiting on the sidelines.
It is a messy map.
Very messy. So if I am a listener, maybe I manage a portfolio, maybe I run a small business that imports. What is this? So what here? How do I actually use this information? I just pull all my money out of the bad countries.
No, that would be a huge mistake. The absolute key takeaway from all the analysis we've done is this. Do not look at countries. Look at time multiplied by target.
Time multiplied by target. Okay, explain that framework.
The good country versus bad country label we just talked about.
Yeah.
That is entirely temporary. It only lasts for this 150-day window of Section 122.
Right.
The real economic story happens after the 150 days.
When the real tools, the 300 and 232 tariffs, come out of the toolbox.
Right. So portfolio risk isn't about Europe versus Asia. It is about automobiles versus retail, or steel versus software services.
Oh, that's interesting. You're saying the sector matters way more than the flag on the factory.
Absolutely. The 15% global tariff is just a bridge. The final destination is highly targeted tariffs. So if you are invested in European automakers, you are in the exact same danger zone as someone invested in Japanese or Korean automakers.
The geography doesn't protect you at all.
Not even a little. The sector defines your risk.
So even a winning country like China, they have specific sectors that are about to get absolutely hammered when the clock runs out.
Exactly. And conversely, even a losing country like Japan might be able to negotiate exceptions for specific items that aren't on the U.S. hit list.
That is a really helpful way to reframe it for you listening. It's not about avoiding Japan. It's about watching out for steel. It's not about buying into China right now. It's about being incredibly wary of digital exports or EVs.
Precisely. You really have to look at what the U.S. economy fundamentally needs. If the U.S. needs critical minerals from an ally, those will probably get an exemption. But if the U.S. feels threatened by foreign electric vehicles, those are going to get hit, regardless of whether they ship from Germany, Korea, or China.
You know, hearing you lay it out like this, it brings up a really provocative thought for me.
What's that?
Well, we are so used to hearing the phrase trade war. And usually it brings up this image of a boxing match. I hit you with a tariff, you hit me back.
The reciprocal approach.
Right. But this feels fundamentally different. We went from a specific law to a Supreme Court ruling to dusting off an obscure law from the 1970s to a ticking 150-day clock to plan secondary investigations.
It's definitely not a simple boxing match anymore. It's much more complex.
Exactly. It feels like we are shifting from broad trade wars to something that looks more like legal guerrilla warfare.
Legal guerrilla warfare. That is a really fascinating term for it, and I think it's highly accurate.
It just seems like the administration is searching every corner of the shed for any legal tool emergency powers, balance of payments, national security clauses, just to find a way to impose these costs.
They're definitely testing the boundaries of trade law.
And so my ultimate question is, if the rules of the game, literally the foundational laws used to set these tariffs, if they change every few months, can any global supply chain actually survive that, regardless of what the actual tax rate is?
That right there is the multi-billion-dollar question.
Because businesses can adapt, right?
Yes, business can handle high costs. You just pass it on or find efficiencies.
Yeah.
What business cannot handle is not knowing what the law will be on Monday morning.
Right.
If you build a massive supply chain based on IEPA, and then the Supreme Court says IEPA is illegal, so you adjust for Section 122, but you know in 150 days you have to adjust again for Section 301.
Efficiency just completely dies.
It dies. The system grinds to a halt because planning becomes impossible.
Well, that is a very sobering thought to end on. For you listening, if you are running a business, you have to stay incredibly flexible right now. And if you are investing, keep your eye on the sectors, not just the countries.
And most importantly, keep your eye on that 150-day clock. It started ticking on Monday.
We will definitely be watching it right along with you. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive into this massive tariff shift. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button.
Thanks for listening.